since 1995 when the WTO started. How many times do you think they succeeded? Once. 43 out of 44 times they could not meet the 5 steps needed to use that exception. So it's a very difficult to use exception, even in the chapters that it applies to, even for the things it applies to, like health and environment, but not women. So you have a partial exception to some chapters that is so hard to use, you almost cannot use it. That is the exception. There's not an exception generally for human rights, of course, no. Certainly not for civil and political rights. And for those of you who wondered about the process, how did we get to here? So, of course, the 12 TPP countries have been negotiating in secret, literally behind closed doors. This is different to how the Climate Change Convention is negotiated, or the WHO Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, or environmental treaties. In those ones, as NGOs, we can go in. We can go into the room, we can receive the copies of the negotiating text, we can make interventions, we can talk to the government, but not in the TPP. Now, the governments say this is because trade law, very secret. If I show my cards, then cannot conclude. But actually, it's not true, because when these same issues were negotiated at the World Trade Organization, same. We talk about trade facilitation, we talk about tariffs, we talk about government procurement, whatever. The texts are regularly released, the negotiating texts, with all the square brackets where they cannot agree. So we can see what is happening. Okay, we can't be in the room, not quite as good as UN, but at least you see the negotiating texts. The TPP, no. Until the text was released in November last year, for 5+ years of negotiations, all we had were the WikiLeaks and leaks on other websites of some of the texts. And it was interesting to hear that the former US Trade Minister, one of the ones who started the TPP negotiations, he actually admitted something. Because in the US, they were negotiating the Free Trade Agreement of the Americas. It was all of North, Central, and South America except Cuba. But it never concluded, because they released the text, the negotiating text, and there was uproar. All the countries, kalang kabut, everybody opposing, they couldn't conclude. There was so much opposition. So the US Trade Minister admitted this. He said, because people asked him, why are you not releasing the text? Because it's basically the US that demands it to be in secret. And he said, we tried that. We released the text in the FTAA, and then we couldn't conclude because there was so much opposition. So he admitted that it is so unpopular that it can only be done in the dark. If anybody knows about it, they won't want it. Now, of course, the negotiations have finished. We cannot change the text. Once the text is done, then we release it to the public, and we saw it in November last year, 6,000 pages. But even though it's 6,000 pages, it's still not clear exactly what it means, because often in these agreements where you can't get all the countries to agree, you deliberately use an ambiguous word. Like this biologics medicine 5-year monopoly was very controversial. US wanted longer. So it says 5 years to deliver a comparable market outcome. What does comparable market outcome mean? Does it mean you have to give a longer monopoly? You don't know as a lawyer, as a matter of legal interpretation, until you see the negotiating history. What was discussed in the room, even orally agreed, we all agree, comparable market outcomes means 8 years. We don't put it in the text, but we are legally bound. That negotiating history, what the text means, will not be released until 4 years after entry into force, so 6 years from now. So we still won't know for 6 years what this thing means, because that negotiating history won't become public. So the process was secret until now, unnecessarily secret. Then it was concluded in October, text released in November, going to be voted on by the Malaysian Parliament in 26, 27, 28 January this year, going to sign on the 4th of February. And then the process is still ratification. So this ratification process is where Malaysia has to change its laws to comply with the TPP. How many laws is that? I don't know. Patent, copyright, trademark, tariffs, labor, a lot lah. And in this process, the US wants more. So Malaysia has given up this much in the signed TPP text. Okay, already quite a lot. For the TPP to come into force, to start operating, it must pass the US Congress, the US Parliament, under their constitution. To pass the US, they currently have what they call a fast-track law. It's supposed to be the US Parliament just votes yes or no to the whole thing, whole 6,000 pages, don't make any changes. But if a majority of the US Congress wants a change, they will say, I will vote no, unless you reopen the text and give me more. And this is what happened to Korea in their US Free Trade Agreement. The text was signed, 4 years later it goes to the US Congress. US Congress says, we will vote no, unless you reopen it and allow more American cars into Korea, and Koreans must eat mad cow beef from America. It was a bit controversial. 300,000 people demonstrating on the streets of Korea every night. The whole cabinet had to offer to resign. The Prime Minister flew to America and said, please, please, you don't force me. He took out a photo of the demonstrations and said, this is what I have to go back to. Because the US, of course, has mad cow beef. Nobody wants to buy it. But they force it down the throats and the Free Trade Agreement make you accept diseased meat. So even with fast track, the Congress can reopen the text and demand changes. And what we think it will be for TPP is probably Malaysia will be disciplined as a currency manipulator, tariffs raised on its exports, ringgit pushed up so its exports are less competitive, that kind of thing, but we're not sure. Okay, so you give up this much in the signed text. Last year it was going to be signed in February this year. You give up more to get through the US Congress. Then there is another stage called certification that is required by US law. If they don't do this, it doesn't get fast track and it won't pass the parliament, because without fast track, every senator can change the text. 100 senators with different demands, it will never pass. What does certification mean? And this is allowed by the TPP. The US has done this since the Chile-US Free Trade Agreement, because Chile was very smart. When they implemented their US Free Trade Agreement, they played a lot of tricks, so they didn't quite implement it. They were supposed to give this 5-year monopoly on medicines, but they said, oh, that is for marketing approval. In Chile, we don't do that. We do sanitary approval, very different. So we don't have to give this 5-year monopoly. Actually, it was the same thing. They were cheating lah. But they were very clever to protect their national interest in the way they were implementing. The US got so angry, they said, never again. We will never fall for this trick again. So ever since the Chile-US FTA, they have been certifying the other country. And that means that to allow it to come into force, the free trade agreement, the US must give a letter. And it's supposed to be that I, the US, have done my implementing laws. But the US abuses it and says, I will only give my letter when I'm satisfied with your implementation, Malaysia. And it becomes like blackmail. The US has a long list of demands of what they want, and you must give him everything. If you don't, it won't come into force. And your exports cannot go to the US with those nice zero tariffs. So the countries give lah. So what they give, what the US asks, is things that are not in the text. Things they asked for that were rejected. Like an additional 3-year monopoly on medicines, they said to Guatemala, you give me. Even though it's not in the signed text, and Guatemala is so poor they cannot afford medicines. And who can ask for this is not just the US Congress and the US Trade Ministry. One US company, Chevron. They didn't like the oil law in the Dominican Republic about transporting oil in trucks. And they wanted it cancelled, repealed. That oil law was legal. It was okay under the Free Trade Agreement. Nothing to do with the Free Trade Agreement. But Chevron didn't like the law lah. So they said to the US government, I want that law repealed. You make it a condition of certification. US government said, yes, sir, Chevron. They turned to the Dominican Republic and said, you repeal that law, or the free trade agreement doesn't come into force, your clothes don't go to the US with zero tariffs. It was a very politically sensitive law. Dominican Republic had to repeal. After that, it came into force. So who can make these demands? US government, US Congress, US companies. And it's not just extra stuff, like change the color of your flag, whatever he doesn't like, but also interpreting. Because remember we talked about comparable market outcome. What does this mean? How many years monopoly do we have to give on medicines? Malaysia will say 5 years. US will say 8 years because they want their medicine companies to make money. So what they do for some countries is they write your implementing law. This happened to Peru. Their whole environmental law was written by the US government. US government gave it to the Peru parliament and said, you pass this with no changes. Cannot change one letter. Otherwise it won't come into force. So the parliament is a rubber stamper for the US government, and the Peru parliament said, yes, sir, America, we pass it with no changes. Please, you let it come into force. So it did. So then what is the role of the Malaysian parliament? The Malaysian parliament is supposed to do least worst implementation of this problematic agreement, but the US government can write the law in the way that favors the US, add a few extra things that are good for the US, and the Malaysian parliament must say, yes, sir, I pass with no changes. This doesn't just happen to developing countries. Even Australia went through this in the Australia-US Free Trade Agreement. The Australian government had to give an extra 20 years in copyright, like Malaysia in the TPP. They didn't want to. They are a net importer of intellectual property. They wanted affordable textbooks for their students, but they had to give life plus 70 years. So they said, okay, we have a broad exception to copyright for our students and fair use and this thing. So that's what the Australian Parliament passed as the implementing law. Big exception. The US government looked at what came out of the Australian Parliament. They said, that is unacceptable. You fail. Go back and do it again. Narrow exception for copyright, otherwise we won't let it come into force. So the Australian Parliament had to have emergency overnight sitting with 3 hours notice, passed a narrow exception for copyright that cannot be used and has not been changed. And then the Americans said, okay, now it is acceptable. Now we let it come into force. So this even happens to the developed countries. So you give up this much in the signed text, what we read today, 6,000 pages. Malaysia gives up this much more to get through the US Congress, and then we give up how much more through certification, we don't know. The last time it was a US free trade agreement with more than one other country, they had different demands for every country. And it came into force at different times, depending how quickly they rolled over and said, yes, sir, America, we give you everything you want. Now you have another 10 demands, we give you that too. Another 20, okay also, until they have squeezed everything they wanted that they could not get in the negotiations. So the question comes back, is this economic colonization? I mean, depends on your definition of economic colonization. If it's that we export raw materials and the foreigners own our land and resources and banks, and we have to do what they say and our parliament is a rubber stamp, is that back to being a colony? Depends on your definition. So there have been various UN special rapporteurs who have expressed concern about the TPP. The UN independent expert on promotion of democratic, equitable international order, he has repeatedly criticized ISDS and the TPP. So then we come to the geopolitics of it. So what happens if you sign, don't sign? So remember, China is not in the TPP. And actually, the TPP can be seen as an anti-China agreement. The US has said we want to encircle China. We want to keep China out of this agreement. This is to restrict China. We are setting the rules of the road, not China. And in fact, in most of the chapters, you can see specific anti-China provisions aimed at Chinese current policies and laws that are there just in case China ever joins the TPP, and along the way everybody else has to comply. Too bad, you are collateral damage. So China so far has not joined. I think they're still figuring out if it's good for them or not. But in some countries like New Zealand, who are very dependent on the Chinese market for exports, the government of New Zealand has said, if the TPP is anti-China, we will not sign because we need to preserve our relationship with China. So then it depends on your assessment of how anti-China it is or not, and how much it has to be before you don't sign. But alongside the TPP, China is also negotiating a free trade agreement called the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, RCEP. So that is ASEAN plus 6, Japan, Korea, China, India, Australia, New Zealand. So Malaysia is in that one as well. So some countries are hedging their bets. They're having it both ways, right? We are in the TPP, the US model. We are also in the RCEP. And both of them are racing to be the model for the APEC Free Trade Agreement, the Asia-Pacific Free Trade Agreement. Do we take the US model with their 30 chapters and stronger intellectual property and ISDS, or do we take the Chinese model? And the Chinese model generally has been about trade in goods. Let's just remove the tariffs on our exports between each other. We don't have the other 24 chapters that the developed countries want, but we don't know this time in RCEP because it's also negotiated in secret. And we know what leaked, for example, was Japan and Korea were proposing stronger intellectual property on medicines and copyright, but hopefully it won't be in RCEP because India will know to resist, and ASEAN includes least developed countries, Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, so poor, and they don't have to do any intellectual property protection at the World Trade Organization as long as they are least developed. So it would be very mean for them to have to agree to the Japan-Korea proposals in RCEP. So the rest of the geopolitics, I'm not an expert on geopolitics, but that's the part that I know. And so some countries who are thinking of joining the TPP, like Korea, they already have a US free trade agreement. So they've already done most of the painful parts, 95%. Not very hard for them to join. Indonesia, the president said he wanted to join, but actually it's against many of his own policies. So I'm not sure he knows what is the substance of the TPP when he made the decision to join, and we'll see if they still join. Philippines has said he wants to join, but it's his mother's constitution which would have to be changed probably to allow foreigners to own land. So a bit tricky for him to change Cory Aquino's constitution. Thailand, under Thaksin the brother, they wanted a Thai-US FTA. Then they had tens of thousands of patients and bankers demonstrating on the streets in the negotiations, so that the negotiators couldn't even get into the venue, and they had to move the negotiations to a golf course 20 kilometers away. And afterwards, the Thai negotiator came out and he thanked the demonstrators. And he said, because of you, I could resist the provisions for stronger intellectual property on medicines. Then they had a coup, and the US government said, we don't negotiate with the military, so not signed. Wow, very dramatic. And then the military came in. And then the military said, we listen to the people. We changed the Thai constitution so that before we can have one of these US free trade agreements, we must consult, must have referendum, parliament must be involved. So the military constitution made it harder for Thailand to join. Then Thaksin, the sister, came in, and she has her briefings every week by her brother, and she wants the TPP again. But she's restricted by the military constitution, which said you must consult, referendum, parliament. Then she got kicked out and we're back to the military again. So now I'm not sure this current military is the same as the last military or not. So Thailand, a bit like that. India hasn't decided to join. Russia is, I think, in APEC, but a bit remote. And they are barely coping with joining the WTO, which they did recently. So I think that was most of the areas that people wanted covered. And now those who came in later, and also those who are here, if you have questions.
On the impact on migration.
Yes, sorry. So we heard, so one of the things, by the way, that's in the investment chapter is free movement of capital. The money can come and go, and you can only have restrictions in emergencies, threat of emergency, and so on. But the people don't move so easily. So in trade law, we call movement of people mode 4. They become a kind of like a thing. And typically the developed countries do not want to lock themselves open to allow foreign workers in. They want to take them when they need them, brain drain the nurses when they need them, and kick them out when they don't need them. They don't want to be forced to be locked open in even a recession with high unemployment that they must take how many foreign workers a year. So they don't like to lock themselves open to allow foreign workers in a trade agreement, even when it's not a recession. If they do allow movement of people, it's usually corporate transferees. Citibank's manager can work in Malaysia. Fly in, fly out lawyers from Australia can work in Malaysia. Accountants can come in, technicians. It's not your unskilled farmers and construction workers. And in the TPP, I haven't read them all yet, but the section that is about movement of people, 11 countries allowed some high-level corporate people to go backwards and forwards. US did not open at all. Not one single Malaysian can go to work in the US. And even if they had opened, of course, if you are a lawyer and you want to work in the US, you must get your law degree recognized by the Bar Council in the